He was a journalist who brought a mighty railroad to its knees. He was a writer of dark fiction, spinning tales of ghosts and ghouls and the terrible deeds of men. He was a feared critic whose poison pen could end a career with a few pointed lines. He was a cynic, an iconoclast, a war hero, an enigma. But it wasn't his life for which he would ultimately be remembered. It was what came next. Ambrose Bierce was born June 24, 1842, in Meigs County, Ohio, the 10th of 13 children. Young Ambrose was a voracious reader. The family had the largest library in town. It would become the boy's sanctuary. He would devour the classics on his father's shelves, reading everything he could get his hands on. Bierce rebelled against his strict Calvinist upbringing from an early age. He left home at 15 to start a new life, turning his back on his family and their beliefs. He took a job as a printer's devil for a small newspaper in northern Indiana, mixing ink and fetching type for the presses. At age 17, Ambrose enrolled at the Kentucky Military Institute. In 1860, after only 1 year, Ambrose left the military academy. His academic transcripts were lost to a fire, shrouding his departure in mystery. Bierce returned to Indiana. He worked as a waiter and handyman at a restaurant and bar in Elkhart, then took a back-breaking job in a brickyard. It was not the life he had imagined for himself. Then, on April 12, 1861, Fort Sumter, a northern military facility, was attacked by the newly formed Confederate Army. For 3 days, the outgunned Union soldiers were bombarded by the South and ultimately evacuated the fort. The Civil War had begun. President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers, and Ambrose immediately signed up as a private with the 9th Indiana Infantry Regiment, Company C. The ragtag group of soldiers fought at Philippi, in what is now West Virginia. It was the first land battle of the war. After what turned out to be a relatively minor skirmish, the regiment made camp for 5 weeks along the picturesque Cheat River in the Allegheny Mountains. With little to do, Bierce wandered aimlessly through the woods. He would remember those weeks of tranquility fondly in his later writings.
It was a strange country. 9 in 10 of us had never seen a mountain nor a hill as high as a church spire until we crossed the Ohio River. To a member of a Plains tribe, born and reared on the flats of Ohio or Indiana, a mountain region was a perpetual miracle.
In April of 1862, the Union Army of 40,000 traveled south down the Tennessee River to set up camp on the West Bank. Neither Brigadier General William Sherman nor his commander Ulysses S. Grant anticipated an attack, and were ill-prepared for one. But the Confederates, 44,000 strong, had marched up from Mississippi in a terrible rainstorm. Grant heard the defending gunfire from a distance and sent a dispatch to William Nelson. Among his men was Ambrose Bierce. The Union soldiers began their arduous 10-mile march to the battle. In his groundbreaking What I Saw of Shiloh, Bierce recounts their arrival and the beaten soldiers they encountered on the sheltered stretch of beach.
They were mostly unarmed. Many were wounded, some dead. These men were defeated, beaten, cowed. They were deaf to duty and dead to shame.
By the time the battle ended, more than 3,000 men were dead, 17,000 wounded, and nearly 4,000 captured or missing. The Union had won, but at a terrible cost. Even the hardened commanders were shocked at the carnage. The specter of Shiloh would haunt Bierce the rest of his life. In May of 1863, Bierce was promoted to topographical engineer, serving on the staff of William B. Hazen. It was exactly the kind of job that appealed to the young loner. But his excitement over the new commission would not last long. In his memoirs, General Hazen would write, "It was very clear, soon after taking up our march into Georgia, that we were not following a retreating army, but one falling back for strategic purposes." The Confederates attacked the unprepared Union lines. Stunned soldiers ran blindly, emerging from the wooded lands to open field, where they were picked off by sharpshooters. Hazen sent his brigade into the fray. They were the last line of defense. They opened fire on the Confederates.
For perhaps 5 minutes, it seemed like an hour, nothing could be heard but the infernal din of their discharge, and nothing could be seen through the smoke but a great ascension of dust from the smitten soil.
After chasing the Confederates for 2 months, General Sherman's army ran up against heavy fortifications at Kennesaw Mountain. Thinking the Southern Army had spread itself too thin, Sherman ordered a full frontal assault. The fighting was especially brutal. Sherman lost 3,000 men in the battle, and among the numerous wounded was Ambrose Bierce. A Confederate sharpshooter's bullet had struck him in the side of the head, fracturing the temporal bone. No one expected him to survive.
These are some of the bloodiest battles of the war. Some of the most brutal. Shiloh, Chickamauga, Sherman's March to the Sea. So even when Bierce wasn't in the thick of the battle, although he often was, particularly in the early years, he was observing some of the most horrific scenes imaginable.
On January 8, 1865, Ambrose Bierce was honorably discharged from the Army. He had served for almost 4 years and had seen some of the worst the war had to offer. But despite the hardships, Bierce relished his time in the Army. Over the years, he would find great comfort remembering the time he spent fighting alongside his brothers in arms. At the war's end, Bierce took a job with the Treasury Department, working for Captain Sherman B. Eaton. Bierce went to work in Alabama, the conquered territory. His job was primarily to recover missing cotton. Anything that had been sold to the Confederacy but never delivered was considered contraband and therefore property of the United States government. Treasury agents were paid a bounty of 25% for every bale confiscated, which in many cases was any cotton they happened to find. Secretary of the Treasury Hugh McCulloch said, "I am sure I sent some honest cotton agents south, but it sometimes seems very doubtful whether any of them remained honest very long." While still a Treasury agent, Bierce received a letter from his former commander, Hazen. The general wanted his wartime cartographer to accompany him on a tour of forts in the mountain districts of Montana and Wyoming. Bierce took the job. Hazen and his men were tasked with inspecting the condition of the forts in the new Platte district. Bierce was promised a promotion to captain for his service. In July of 1866, he joined his former commander in Omaha. The small group of men headed west. When they arrived at Fort Reno in August, they were warned of Sioux attacks on civilian wagon trains. Several days after their arrival, 2 travelers were killed near the fort. Hazen ordered 2 companies from Fort Laramie to guard against future attacks. Though the battle-hardened Hazen feared no man, the Sioux did concern some members of the party.
The flames of a campfire stand up tall and straight toward the black sky. We feed it constantly with sagebrush. At irregular intervals, we hear the distant howling of the wolf. We check our talk to listen. We cast quick glances at our weapons, our saddles, our picketed horses. The wolves may be of the variety known as Sioux.
Before the inspection of the forts was complete, General Hazen was ordered back to Washington, D.C. He and his men headed to the nearest port. San Francisco of the 1860s was a bustling metropolis of 100,000. In those days, it was one of the few Western cities with at least a touch of culture. It was an isolated place, an oasis. Bierce's commission papers were waiting for him at the old Presidio Army base. He was to be made a second lieutenant, a lower rank than Hazen had led him to believe. Bierce resigned from the Army, never to return. With his military career behind him, Bierce took the only job he could find, as a night watchman at the U.S. Mint. It was a dull, uneventful job, but it allowed him time to study the classics and work on his writing skills. His first published piece was a poem called Basilica. It ran in The Californian on September 21, 1867. It was the work of an amateur. The poem was not well received. In 1868, at the age of 26, Ambrose Bierce was hired on at the San Francisco News-Letter and Commercial Advertiser. James W. Watkins, the paper's editor, was impressed with the young man who had sent in a few pieces to the Town Crier column. Before long, Bierce took over the column, skewering, belittling, or humiliating anyone he saw fit. San Franciscans were taken with this upstart columnist who feared no man or institution. His readers began calling him the wickedest man in San Francisco. Bierce's star continued to rise. He wrote a series of pieces for Bret Harte's prestigious Overland Monthly that gained him an even larger audience. The dapper young bachelor seemed to have it all: a job that made him a San Francisco celebrity, the freedom to write on virtually any subject he chose, and young ladies swooning over him. But something was missing. That something took the form of the beautiful daughter of a prosperous 49er, Molly Day. She was intelligent and well-bred, a member of one of the best families in San Francisco. Bierce was smitten with the young woman and soon began to court her. Molly and Ambrose were married Christmas Day, 1871. Her father sent the couple to England for their honeymoon the following year. The newlyweds arrived in London at the height of the so-called American Rage. Though he was an unknown to the English readers when he arrived, Bierce was determined to make a name for himself. He hoped to be something more than a mere journalist. He wanted to write literature. In December of 1872, their first son, Day, was born in Bristol. Much to Bierce's chagrin, his mother-in-law shipped out to England to visit her daughter and grandson. Bierce put together his first collection, The Fiend's Delight, for publisher John Camden Houghton. It was not a collection of short stories as Bierce had hoped, but primarily a collection of his Town Crier columns from America. In the winter of 1873, Bierce met Mark Twain for a second time. Their previous meeting had been a brief one at the offices of the News-Letter in San Francisco. This time, they met at the White Friars Club on Fleet Street. Bierce had earlier criticized Twain over his marriage to the daughter of a wealthy man in 1870, a sin Bierce himself would also commit.
He had a fairly tortured relationship with Mark Twain, and I think expressed considerable envy and resentment that Twain had become more famous than he did for doing basically the same things, writing journalism, writing humorous sketches, being a kind of celebrity of the West, especially in England. They both were in England in the 1870s, and it was Twain and others who were getting the notoriety, but not Bierce so much. And this tendency persisted throughout Bierce's life. I think he felt that he deserved better. He wanted to be famous. He never really was famous. In fact, he called himself famously obscure, and you can tell there's a certain bitterness in that.
He was hailed as one of the most original and daring humorists this age has produced. Bierce would later disagree with this characterization of him as a humorist. He was an instrument with a sharper edge. He wrote,
"Humor is tolerant, tender, its ridicule caresses. Wit stabs, begs pardon, and turns the weapon in the wound."
Bierce was certainly no humorist. He applied for a job with the weekly magazine Fun. Owner Tom Hood knew of Bierce's work with the newsletter and hired the young American on the spot. He and Bierce became close friends. Ambrose and Molly had a second son, Lee, in 1874. Once the sickly baby boy was healthy, Molly's mother returned to the United States. Bierce's third book, Cobwebs from an Empty Skull, was a collection of tales and fables originally published in Fun. He took little joy in its publication, commenting on the quality of his work.
"I have the supremest contempt for my books, as books. As a journalist, I believe I am unapproachable in my line. As an author, a slouch."
You really can't understand Bierce's true stature unless you read a significant portion of that journalism, because that really, he devoted so much attention to it, so much of his mind and heart went into that journalism, and remote as some of that is in terms of the people it talks about or the issues it talks about, it is a great contribution and a major aspect of Bierce's work.
On November 20th, 1874, Tom Hood died suddenly at the age of 39. Bierce's one true friend in England was gone. The two men, in one of their many late-night talks, had made a pact in which the first to die would attempt to contact the other from beyond the grave. During a late-night walk past Warwick Castle some months later, Bierce was convinced that he felt the presence of his friend's spirit. The experience would inspire one of his most famous stories, The Damned Thing. In May of 1875, the homesick Molly took the boys for a visit to America. In September, Molly informed her husband that she was 6 months pregnant with their next child and would not be returning. Bierce headed back to the States. He would never see his beloved England again. San Francisco was in the throes of a depression. Bierce approached his old boss Marriott, who had promised that Bierce could have his town crier job back. But neither had anticipated the state of the economy. Marriott did purchase some freelance pieces from Bierce, however. Among them were 48 words, cynically defined, The Devil's Dictionary. It was originally published by Doubleday in 1906 as The Cynic's Word Book. Over the years, Bierce would continue to add to his unique collection of definitions until they numbered over 1,000. In October of 1875, Bierce fell into a deep depression. His third child had just been born, this time a daughter they called Helen. The family obligations were almost more than Bierce could bear. He began to drink heavily. He moved his family to San Rafael to help lessen the severity of his asthma. He continued to struggle financially, taking what work was offered to him. Remembered for his skills as a wartime cartographer, Bierce was hired to draw a map of the Black Hills region for the Placer Mining Company. The Dakota Territory was beginning to draw the attention of fortune seekers with its promise of easy gold. Bierce didn't realize it at the time, but the seeds of a future endeavor had been planted. In 1877, Bierce was hired as associate editor of a new publication called The Argonaut. Not long into his tenure at the paper, however, Bierce had disagreements with the Argonaut's publisher, Frank Pixley. Pixley thought the paper should be a weapon of class warfare, while Bierce wanted it to be a literary journal. In the end, Bierce grew tired of Pixley and his literary ignorance. Upon the owner's death, some 18 years later, Bierce would write a blistering epitaph. In 1877, Bierce and his two friends, T.A. Harcourt and William Roloffson, perpetrated a literary hoax that grabbed the public's attention. They wrote a book under the name William Herman entitled The Dance of Death. In it, they claimed that the waltz was a seditious conspiracy to undermine public morals. Bierce then devoted entire columns denouncing his own book and its ridiculous conclusions, while the Methodist Church Conference, in defiance of Bierce, strongly endorsed it. The hoax was a financial success. Over 18,000 copies were sold, a large print run for West Coast press of the era. But the fun wouldn't last long. San Francisco journalism was an unforgiving profession. Not only did the newspapermen attack the rich and powerful, they attacked one another.
There were constantly editors challenging each other to duels and barroom brawls, and basically anything goes.
The degree to which Bierce was fearless in his journalism can be shown by how he stood up to a lot of the big-name politicians or political figures or businessmen or whoever who did not like a lot of what Bierce said about them, and in some cases either threatened to kill him or threatened lawsuits or actually engaged in lawsuits.
Tired of his life in San Francisco and his career in journalism, Bierce struck out for the Dakota Gold Country in 1880, taking a job with the very same company for whom he had drawn the map previously, the Black Hills Placer Mining Company. Bierce was so certain of his impending success that he told his friend Harry Sampson that he was about to give up the infernal newspaper business for good and all. It was July of 1880 when Bierce arrived in Rockerville, an untamed town in the western part of what is now South Dakota. His job was to oversee the building of a 17-mile-long wooden box flume from the Spring Creek Reservoir to the gold-rich dry lands below, so that the newly irrigated lands could then be prospected. Bierce was drawn to the project by Sherburne Eaton, who had, after leaving his treasury job in the South, become a lawyer with the New York law firm representing the mining company. Bierce was made general agent and put in charge of day-to-day operations. He soon discovered, however, that the company had been grossly mismanaged, overpaying for land, company money used for personal gain, while many of the workers themselves labored for weeks on end without pay. Bierce had walked into a hornet's nest.
Before you gentlemen lose any more money playing at mining, would it not be prudent to learn the business? Under your present system, you would assuredly not make a cent out of the richest mine in the world. The men are practically masters of the situation, so long as we are in their debt.
And it wasn't just the employees of the mine who posed problems for Bierce. One night, he was traveling through the Black Hills with $30,000 in company gold. Boone May, an indicted murderer, sat beside him as a guard, a rifle between his knees. On that fateful night, a lone bandit attempted to rob the men on the trail. Before Bierce could even react, May had drawn his gun and fired, killing the bandit where he stood. The owners of the mine were not pleased that Bierce had secured the services of such an unsavory character. When Bierce listed Boone May on the payroll ledger, he described the man's position simply as murderer. His employers were not amused. Despite Bierce's best efforts, the poorly run Placer Mining Company soon ran out of money. He traveled to New York in an attempt to secure more cash to meet their payroll obligations, but by the time he reached the city, the company was already insolvent. He returned to San Francisco, dispirited, disillusioned, and broke. Bierce was not welcomed back to the Argonaut, but instead took a job with a competing paper called The Wasp. The Wasp was as firmly anti-railroad as Bierce himself. The two were a perfect match. Bierce was an unrelenting critic who pulled no punches. Many newspapers were on the railroad's payroll, as were judges, assemblymen, and local politicians of all levels. Standing against the railroad was career suicide, or worse. Bierce had made a reputation for himself, both as a newspaperman and a writer of dark fiction while at the Wasp. But the paper was sold, and after some disagreements with the new owner, Bierce moved on. He was without a job for the next year, wandering from small town to small town. Bierce had burned bridges with most of his former employers and was having a difficult time finding work. He moved to Oakland to be near his brother Albert. Late one afternoon, Ambrose was awakened by a gentle tapping on the door. Standing at his doorstep was a young man. "I'm from the San Francisco Examiner," he said. "You've come from Mr. Hearst," Bierce said. "No, I am Mr. Hearst." William Randolph Hearst had received the San Francisco Examiner as a gift from his father. When William took over the paper, it already had a circulation of 30,000. But he thought the paper should be more daring and colorful. "We must be alarmingly enterprising. We must be honest and fearless." Hearst began to assemble a staff of the best journalists in the West, and among his brightest stars was Ambrose Bierce.
I think when Hearst first hired Bierce in 1887, Bierce really took it as a lifeline. He had worked for a number of good papers, mostly weeklies, The Wasp, and before that, The Argonaut. But I think he had come to a certain end of that phase of his work, and he was sort of at loose ends. And here was the young William Randolph Hearst, only 23 years old, coming to Bierce, as one of the first things he did when he took over the Examiner and said, "Bierce, I want you to be my star editorial writer." And Bierce, I think, was hugely flattered at that, and over the next at least 5 to 6 years, wrote some of the best journalism and some of the best short fiction of his career, and it all was in the Examiner.
In 1888, Bierce published his first story with the Examiner, One of the Missing. It was a chilling Civil War piece devoid of patriotic notions of the glory of battle. Bierce wrote about the fear of war and of war's true nature. Despite the formal, journalistic style of the story, readers were spellbound. He wrote by candlelight from dusk till dawn, and he kept a human skull on his desk. Some say it was the skull of a friend, others the skull of an enemy. Though Bierce was again enjoying some professional success, his home life suffered. He was an absentee husband and chauvinist who publicly attacked the institution of marriage in print every chance he got. Molly, all but abandoned by her husband, was wooed by a wealthy Danish bachelor. The Dane spent his summers in St. Helena, where Bierce had settled his family, and was smitten with Molly. Bierce, on one of his infrequent visits home, found the Dane's letters and flew into a rage. He packed his things and left for good. To compound matters, oldest son Day, now 15, announced that he was dropping out of school to become a journalist. He ran off to work for the Red Bluff Sentinel. Day soon fell in love with a young woman named Eva Adkins. The object of his affection worked at a cannery in Chico. The possessive Day quit his job at the paper and took a job at the cannery as well. Unfortunately for Day, Eva didn't share his infatuation. She began dating a friend behind his back, a young man by the name of Neil Hubbs. One evening, Eva and Neil silently slipped out of town and were married. The couple returned to the boarding house owned by Eva's mother, where Day had rented a room. The jilted lover flew into a rage and shot Neil, then turned the gun on Eva and fired again, striking her behind the ear. Neil wrestled the gun from Day, then the newlyweds fled. The distraught Bierce went up to his room, doused a cloth with chloroform, laid it over his face, and shot himself in the temple. Both men lingered for several days before dying of their wounds. Day's last words were simply, "Send for my father." In 1891, Bierce's first collection of fiction, Tales of Soldiers and Civilians, was published. It consisted of 19 stories that first ran in the Examiner. The collection was praised by critics as boldly experimental. And the most popular of his stories in the collection was An Occurrence at Owl Creek Ridge.
It's by far his biggest, most well-known piece. What I think attracts people to it is that it's realistic, but there's the element of the supernatural.
That story really deserves its celebrity. It is a masterwork in every possible way. I mean, it is a Civil War story, it is a horror story, it is a psychological horror story. It is written with absolute precision in terms of understanding the mentality of a person, in dire straits. Bierce was a master at that kind of thing. What do you feel? What do you think when you're in a position where you could lose your life?
Stephen Crane, whose The Red Badge of Courage was greatly influenced by Bierce, proclaimed, "The story has everything. Nothing better exists." It was first made into a film by Charles Vidor in 1929, and it was filmed once more in 1963 by Robert Enrico, winning an Academy Award, then running as an episode of The Twilight Zone.
You are standing on a bridge over Owl Creek, a noose around your neck. You have but a few seconds left to live, a few seconds left to plan your escape.
In 1896, Bierce met a 22-year-old poet by the name of George Sterling. He moved west from Long Island after forsaking a career in the priesthood. Bierce and the young poet met at Brother Albert's campsite at Lake Temescal near Oakland. Sterling was a huge Bierce fan and was thrilled to meet him. Ambrose was flattered by the admiration, a weakness of character that would draw all manner of lesser talents into his orbit. Bierce's second book of fiction, Can Such Things Be?, was rejected by critics for being excessively morbid. Ghosts, mad dogs, machines come to life, Moxon's master, the stranger, the damned thing, and an inhabitant of Carcosa.
That book must have been read fairly early on after publication by Robert W. Chambers, because Chambers then, in his classic book, The King in Yellow, which came out in 1895, makes all these vague allusions to Carcosa, to Haita, to Hastur, which is also a Bierce invention. And then H.P. Lovecraft comes along, and he starts picking up these references, whether directly from Bierce or through Chambers, it's not clear. But so then that becomes incorporated in what became the Cthulhu mythos of H.P. Lovecraft and his successors. And now, indirectly, Bierce has become famous for this whole Carcosa mythos, although mostly it's focused on Chambers, but nevertheless, the origin is Bierce.
And when Bierce wasn't writing fiction, he acted as a critic. And what a feared critic he was. A bad word from him could ruin a budding career. A young female author once requested a single-sentence criticism of her work. Bierce obliged her. In 1896, Hearst sent Bierce to Washington, D.C. to campaign against the Railroad Funding Bill. The bill was introduced by Collis Huntington, the last surviving member of the railroad barons Bierce had opposed so fiercely. The bill would restructure the $75 million debt of the Southern Pacific owed the government for loans and land grants. It was no secret that Huntington was buying votes in Congress in order to pass what would, in essence, be a forgiveness of the debt. Bierce rolled up his sleeves and took after the man in print. He was merciless in his attacks. Bierce wrote with a clear, concise style for the Eastern papers. He realized that he was writing for a national audience, and a straightforward, all-out attack was the best method to sway the public. After months of relentlessly attacking the railroad, Huntington broke. On the steps of the nation's capital, he confronted Bierce. "Name your price," Huntington said. "Every man has his price."
My price is $75 million to be handed to the Treasurer of the United States.
Bierce won the battle with the railroad, and the funding bill was defeated. It was not just the drive of his investigative journalism that won the battle. It was his biting wit, exhibited by a parting shot at Huntington.
He deserves to hang from every branch of every tree of every state and territory penetrated by his railroads, with the sole exception of Nevada, which has no trees.
Bierce was hailed as a muckraking hero. For a time, at least, he would be seen as a champion of the people. He returned to fawning praise in California. In 1901, tragedy struck again. This time it was his son, Lee. He didn't inherit the hot temper of his father, but he did share his father's alcoholic tendencies. Lee had blossomed into a talented reporter for the Los Angeles Record, then the New York Telegraph. But one frigid evening, while delivering provisions to the needy for his newspaper, Lee became stupendously drunk and stayed out most of the night. He suffered from severe exposure. From his bed, the gravely ill Lee asked for his sister Helen. Ambrose wired his daughter, who was in Los Angeles at the time. On March 31, 1901, Lee died of pneumonia, a month short of his 27th birthday. Ambrose was devastated once more. Of his 3 children, only his daughter remained. Later that year, on a trip to Washington, D.C., Bierce was called to the White House to meet with President Teddy Roosevelt. The boisterous president wanted to meet the man who had written the story, A Son of the Gods, which had inspired Roosevelt's apocryphal horseback ride up San Juan Hill. Roosevelt had previously thwarted Bierce's boss, Hearst, from winning the governorship of New York. He repeated old charges that Hearst had instigated the assassination of President McKinley.
His enemies dug up this little quatrain that Bierce had written back in 1901 when, I believe it was the governor of Kentucky, had been assassinated. And Bierce wrote this little squib, 4 lines long, that suggested that maybe William McKinley, the president, would be next. And sure enough, McKinley was next. He was assassinated later in 1901. And so Hearst's political enemies took that as a sign that here's this employee of William Randolph Hearst who not only predicted McKinley's assassination, but advocated it, which of course is nonsense. But as I say, in politics, anything goes.
Hearst was the man his detractors were really after. The name Ambrose Bierce was hardly mentioned. Ironically, Hearst was an active promoter, and some would say the cause, of the Spanish-American War, a war that would launch the political career of his most powerful detractor, Teddy Roosevelt. In 1905, estranged wife Molly died in Los Angeles of heart failure. Molly had filed for an official divorce only a few months earlier, believing incorrectly that her husband wished to remarry. With Molly gone, Carrie Christensen, longtime family friend, became his caretaker and secretary. She helped Bierce through his bouts of asthma and aided in sorting out his piles of manuscripts. On April 18, 1906, a massive earthquake struck San Francisco, leveling much of the city. Once the rumbling stopped, the fires began. They raged for 3 days, destroying over 400 city blocks. 40,000 people lost their homes, and another 3,000 lost their lives. Among the ruined buildings was that of the San Francisco Examiner. Shortly thereafter, Bierce, working for a Hearst newspaper in the East, retired from the business for good. Over the years, he had quit multiple times over one imagined slight or another. This time, however, the resignation from the newspaper was permanent. He took a part-time job with a Hearst-owned magazine, Cosmopolitan, writing a monthly column called The Passing Show. But Bierce was out of place at the magazine. He was old, weary, and seen as a reactionary by the young staff. He resigned from the magazine in 1908. After his resignation, friend and publisher Walter Neal convinced Bierce to compile a 12-volume set of his collected works. Bierce, along with Miss Christensen, would spend the next 2 years madly assembling articles, stories, poems, and letters. Bierce wanted to show the entirety of his work. He didn't feel it was right to collect only his best pieces.
The Neal Publishing Company was not exactly a top-flight publisher, and Bierce could not have published this edition with anybody else. I mean, nobody else among the standard publishers was going to issue 12 volumes.
After finishing his collected works, Bierce needed a break. He spent some time in New York with Neal, but the experience exhausted the aging writer. Bierce decided to return to California. He sold his few possessions and headed home. The ship from New York docked in Panama for 3 days. He marveled at the construction of the canal.
I had a pleasant but rather long voyage, was 3 days in Panama, and saw something of the canal work, the magnitude whereof transcends expression.
Bierce arrived in San Francisco in 1910. The city had been largely rebuilt, but vestiges of the great earthquake and fire of 1906 remained. He no longer recognized the city that had been his home for so many years. Less than a month after Bierce's return, Mark Twain died. Though the two had never been close, the passing of this icon troubled Bierce. He realized that his time in San Francisco had passed, that he had become nothing more than a curiosity. Bierce returned to Washington, D.C., only to learn of yet another tragedy, the death of his friend, Percival Pollard. Bierce traveled to Baltimore to pay his respects. There were few mourners in attendance. Walter Neal, who had published 2 of Pollard's books, was there, as was a young literary critic by the name of H.L. Mencken. Mencken would, in later years, become a cynic every bit as biting as the man he called the only genuine wit produced in America. His publication, The American Mercury, would praise Ambrose Bierce and introduce his work to a new generation. But Mencken was also critical of his cynical predecessor. He would later write, "It never seemed to have occurred to Bierce that language, like literature, is a living thing and not a mere set of rules." Bierce, the restless traveler, returned to California for one final visit. He stayed in Oakland for a short while and also spent some time with Albert in his cabin. Bierce met up with George Sterling at the Bohemia Club along the Russian River. In Bierce's absence, Sterling had found a new idol to worship, Jack London. Sterling had written letters to Bierce while he was away, speaking fondly of London. Bierce despised the man's socialist politics and what he viewed as an immoral lifestyle. and London was no Bierce fan either. He once said, Bierce would bury his best friend with a sigh of relief and express satisfaction that he was done with him. When the two men were finally introduced at the bar of the Bohemia Club, a crowd gathered. They were prepared for a battle of literary titans. But Bierce surprised them all and offered his hand. The two men greeted one another in a civil manner. Bierce's kind treatment of London was due in large part to the fact that London's first child had just recently died. Bierce understood that sort of pain better than most. Friends visiting Bierce during his final stay in California noted how, for the first time, he seemed old. Bierce wrote to friends and family, laying out his plans for the future. He would head south to Mexico to fight with Pancho Villa, or die trying. The plan was an ambitious one for a chronic asthmatic of 71. On his journey south, he stopped to rest in New Orleans. While in the city, he gave an interview to a reporter from the New Orleans States, in which he confirmed that he was headed to Mexico. The reporter described his meeting with Bierce. Except for the thick, snow-white hair, no one would think him old. His hands are steady, and he stands up straight and tall, perhaps 6 feet. His eyes, blue and piercing as when they strove to see through the smoke at Chickamauga, retained all the fire of the indomitable fighter. Not exactly the frail old man described by his friends. He stopped in San Antonio for a visit to Fort Sam Houston, where he was treated like an honored dignitary. He enjoyed the attention for a time, then made his way south to Laredo and beyond. So what really happened to Ambrose Bierce? That depends on who you ask. Most agree that he headed to Mexico with $2,000 in gold and a thirst for long-lost adventure. Beyond this, however, the theories diverge. Biographer Carrie McWilliams claimed Bierce was killed in a battle at Ojinaga, though he also entertained the theory that Bierce had survived and was eventually killed on the battlefield of Torreon. Biographer and co-author of The Monk and the Hangman's Daughter, Adolf Danziger, claimed to have spoken with Villa, who had admitted he'd had Bierce thrown out of town for threatening to join sides with one of his rivals. Then some of Villa's men had shot Bierce and left his body for the vultures. But Danziger, who'd had a rocky relationship with Bierce, and the truth, is hardly a reliable source. A story appeared in the Washington Post April 27, 1919. Bierce was discovered wandering with a Mexican convoy, carrying machine guns and ammunition. They were taken before the ruthless General Urbina. The two men were shot and buried along the side of the trail. The New York World reported on April 3, 1915, that Bierce's daughter Helen had received a letter from her father. In it, he explained that he was in France, serving on Lord Kitchener's staff, a man Bierce had corresponded with in regards to military strategy. Despite the report, Helen denied ever having seen such a letter. Biographer Vincent Starrett related this story told to him by a friend. An unnamed Mexican national had seen a portrait of Bierce in the friend's office and claimed to know him. As of 1918, he was allegedly living in the town of San Luis Potosi. The locals referred to him as Don Ambrosio. According to Starrett's friend, Bierce intended to reappear from death and astound the world. The world is still waiting. Edward Tex O'Reilly, cowboy, soldier, and author of some of the original Pecos Bill stories, had another tale to tell. He claimed that while he was in El Paso, gathering supplies for Villa's army, he heard from Bierce. Some of the newspaper men covering the war told O'Reilly that the old writer was in town and wanted to meet with Villa. The hotel clerk passed a note to O'Reilly from Bierce saying he would like to get together, but the old writer never showed. Several days later, O'Reilly learned of the death of an old American in Sierra Mojada. The man had come riding into town, alone. He stayed for several days with federal troops, not realizing they were those battling against Villa. Bierce had asked questions about trails and drew some maps. He told the men he was trying to reach Villa's army. Thinking him a spy, they shot him. He'd been buried more than a week when O'Reilly arrived. They showed him Bierce's final resting place beside an adobe wall in a little cemetery. O'Reilly burned his name into a board with a hot iron and set up the makeshift headstone beside his grave. Or so the story goes. Walter Neal believed that Bierce had taken matters into his own hands. The old journalist carried a German revolver with him, a gift from a friend. Neal claimed that Bierce used it to kill himself. He even, allegedly, showed Neal a photo of the Grand Canyon that he had taken, a spot where his body would be protected from the vultures. A fantastical tale about Bierce's fate pairs him with A. Mitchell Hedges, British explorer and source of the original famed crystal skull of South America. According to this dubious chain of events, the two men fought with Villa for 10 months, then continued into the heart of South America, where they spied on the Germans prior to World War I. In this story, Bierce then traveled to Europe for a time, before returning to South America and eventually dying in Panama. And the stories go on. Initially, only Carrie Christensen launched a search for Bierce. She wrote a letter of inquiry to the U.S. consul in Chihuahua City. He assured Carrie that he knew of every American who had come to the city, and he had not heard of Bierce's presence there. Over the years, many people have searched for clues regarding the disappearance of Ambrose Bierce, including his daughter Helen. The trail, however, has long since gone cold.
Well, one of the interesting angles has always been that whatever happened to Bierce literally just disappeared. If he were going to be famous, not just for being a writer, it seemed like it would be that. But again, it just remains a sort of cult figure.
Bierce really was there right at the founding of California literature with the Overland Monthly in the 1860s, Bret Harte, Ina Coolbrith, and writers like that, who really got California on the map, and certainly Mark Twain as well. And he was right there and stayed on there. But because I think Bierce devoted himself mostly to journalism and mostly to local topics, interesting only to San Franciscans, his reputation didn't spread throughout the nation.
Ambrose Bierce's work has been widely anthologized and adapted for film, radio, and stage. Bierce himself has been a character in stories by Robert Heinlein, Gerald Kirsch, and his most famous appearance as the title character in the Carlos Fuentes novel, The Old Gringo. Despite his reputation as a bitterly realistic writer, Bierce's stories dealt far more often with the fantastical. Bierce himself wrote 3 stories about unexplained disappearances in his collection Can Such Things Be?, The Difficulty of Crossing a Field, An Unfinished Race, and Charles Ashmore's Trail. But a 4th should be added to this list. It's not a story he wrote, but rather one he lived. Biographer Fatu put it best: never the inhuman monster of his enemies, nor the blameless god of his idolaters, but a troubled human being. As is only fitting, the last line belongs to Bierce himself.
Nobody will find my bones.